Certainly appreciate everybody being here today. We are here today to release the results of our special examination of the contracts, operations, and activities of the Kentucky Communications Network Authority, often referred to as KentuckyWired. Now, we started our examination in January of this year, and while we are releasing the results of the examination today, our work will not end. Now, I will explain the reasons for that in just a bit, but first, I want to focus on the results of our examination thus far. Our examination contains 9 findings pertaining to KentuckyWired, and our entire report is being referred to the Executive Branch Ethics Commission for further review and possible action by that agency. In trying to describe exactly what our team found as they dug through the various contracts and activities of KentuckyWired dating back to its formation, it was much like peeling back the layers of an onion. Now, certainly I wish I had better news, but our work only confirms the extent of the problems. The project is nearly $100 million over budget for construction cost, and the original planned completion date, as many of you know, has already passed. Meanwhile, taxpayers are paying availability payments to the contractors for a network that isn't available. Now, one of the most important questions answered by our auditors is exactly how much Kentucky's taxpayers are on the hook for the cost to build KentuckyWired. When KentuckyWired was announced in 2014, most of the project funding was supposed to come from the private sector, with only a small percentage coming from the Commonwealth, including $30 million appropriated by the General Assembly during the 2014 legislative session. That's because KentuckyWired was announced as a public-private partnership, or P3, in which the private sector would bear the majority of the cost to construct and maintain more than 3,400 miles of fiber. Now, the pie chart on display, which is on page 50 of our exam, reflects what KCNA initially reported as the breakdown cost for financing KentuckyWired. During the 2014 session, the concept for this project was brought to the table by Congressman Rogers, who wanted to see a high-speed fiber network built in eastern Kentucky and had worked to secure $23.5 million in federal funding for the project. Governor Beshear pushed for expanding the network to a statewide project. Now, I was a member of the General Assembly at the time $30 million was appropriated towards the project, and like others, I was led to believe that would be the extent of the Commonwealth's contribution to the construction of the network. Through the work of our auditors on this examination, we have determined that over the 30-year P3 agreement, the Commonwealth and its taxpayers will be on the hook for almost $1.5 billion. Let me say that, $1.5 billion with a B in total cost. Now, I can assure you, no legislator, even the strongest supporters of KentuckyWired, believed that they would be authorizing $1.5 billion in spending for this project. Misled does really not do justice for this bait and switch on the taxpayers. Now, when you hear this total cost, the first question that comes to mind is, how did the Commonwealth get itself into this position? Now, in hindsight, it's clear that the problems began during the procurement and contract negotiation process as key terms changed to shift risk from the private sector to the Commonwealth. Now, the initial vendor's response to the RFP for the project and the majority of the project financing and risk is key there, were placed on the private sector, but these terms were essentially reversed by the time the project agreement was signed in September of 2015. Now, finding 2 in our report, which will be posted following this press conference, will be on our website at auditor.ky.gov, details how the terms of the initial agreement were changed during the procurement process. Of particular significance, rather than allowing the private sector to raise capital, the Commonwealth created a nonprofit entity named KentuckyWired Infrastructure Company, or QUIC, to issue tax-exempt financing for the project. Now, when this decision was made, not only to issue Commonwealth-backed debt, but also to make contractual commitment that taxpayers would back availability payments, or in this case, non-availability payments, and other costs, It essentially rejected the proposal by the main private contractor to fully fund the project through outside capital. Now, this decision also creates a potential for the Commonwealth's bond rating to be impacted in any termination scenario. The bonding not only places a considerable burden on taxpayers, but also removed an incentive for private contractors to complete the KentuckyWired project on time. Also, during the contract negotiation process, the Commonwealth assumed the responsibility and risk of obtaining pole attachments and did so with unrealistic timeframes. The difficulty of obtaining permission to attach fiber to existing utility poles has caused a lot of the project delays, and the impact this problem is compounded because the Commonwealth agreed to compensate the contractors for the cost related to these delays. So not only are the taxpayers responsible for the availability payments, but also cost overages, future maintenance, and now up to $110 million in settlement money approved by the General Assembly in the last legislative session. Also, between the initial contribution and debt backed by the taxpayers, the Commonwealth is responsible for 93% of the cost for KentuckyWired, while private equity only makes up a little more than 1%. Another chart on display, which is on page 37, shows a flow chart that illustrates the convoluted arrangement and number of both public and private entities involved in the KentuckyWired project, which is this one right here. Essentially, the Commonwealth played a shell game and appears to make the taxpayers the loser in that shell game. In addition to misleading taxpayers on their share of the burden to build KentuckyWired, taxpayers were also misled regarding the revenue stream to finance the network. Now, when the project was initially announced, it was anticipated that Kentucky's K-12 schools would switch from private providers to KentuckyWired. This was important because the schools received federal E-rate funding for certain information technology expenditures, including broadband internet services. However, one requirement for E-rate funding is that the services be obtained through a fair, competitive bidding process. Now, auditors learned that as early as January of 2015, officials at the Kentucky Department of Education expressed internal concerns that KentuckyWired would not be E-rate eligible. In June of 2015, Kentucky's Education Commissioner sent a letter to the Secretary of the Finance Cabinet clearly stating that the contractual setup of KentuckyWired prevented it from being E-rate eligible. Now, despite these repeated findings and warnings and concerns from KDE, the Finance Cabinet signed a project agreement to build the network and moved forward with an RFP for K-12 internet services. A private internet provider challenged the RFP, alleging, quote, "This procurement is riddled with conflicts of interest and insider preferences that fly in the face of federal E-rate regulations and Kentucky statutory requirements," end quote. And after that, the Finance Cabinet decided to cancel the RFP. As a result, there are no current plans to transfer K-12 schools to KentuckyWired. K-12 schools constituted 45%, nearly half, of the needed funding for availability payments over the 30-year of the agreement. Now, the loss of that 45% will significantly increase the financial burden to the Commonwealth and its taxpayers. Now, the bar you see here, which is on page 57 of our report, illustrates the projected burden of KentuckyWired on the state's general fund. Even if K-12 schools do eventually migrate their internet services to KentuckyWired, there is still an estimated financial burden on the general fund, which will be significant to the budget for decades to come. In addition to the future general fund burden illustrated, cost overruns have increased the original cost estimates to build the system. Our report finds that if everything goes well for KentuckyWired going forward, the cost will come in nearly $100 million over the original construction estimate, and this is a 35% cost overrun. Now, I mentioned earlier the warnings sent by the officials at the Department of Education about E-rate eligibility of KentuckyWired. Another warning the Commonwealth received, but apparently ignored, was regarding the potential for problems with pole attachments. Not only did the Commonwealth move forward, state officials agreed to assume responsibility for the pole attachments. Additionally, the Commonwealth relied on inaccurate estimates of the number of poles owned by companies like AT&T and Windstream. Originally, planners estimated that they only needed 5,000 poles owned by AT&T for the project, when in reality, they needed 12,000. Also, planners initially thought they only needed 750 poles owned by Windstream, when in reality, they needed nearly 8,000. Now, claims related to pole attachment agreements are part of the basis for the $88 million settlement memorandum Commonwealth signed early this year. In addition to the $88 million for settlement, legislators also approved $22 million for future cost overruns during construction of the network. Now, it is important to note that as of last month, state officials are still attempting to negotiate the details of the settlement itself. It is expected that the money for the $110 million approved in the 2018 legislative session will come from the issuance of another round of revenue bonds, which again may place the burden of payment back on the Commonwealth and the taxpayers. Now, in addition, there are at least $24.6 million of contractor claims regarding easement costs for the project. Now, these claims, listen closely, that $24.6 million, these claims are not resolved in the settlement and are expected to be litigated in court. Future revenue from the network has been cited as the reason the project should be continued to completion. Now, for those expecting future benefits from the network, it is important to note that revenue models call for fees to increase continually for private users of KentuckyWired. However, cost should be driven down by the competitive market. For example, we learned that revenue projections for KentuckyWired called for an annual increase of 2.5% for wholesale price each year over the life of the network. This certainly doesn't seem logical if the premise of KentuckyWired is to lower the cost of broadband services by increasing competition. Now, our report details the speculative nature of the future revenue projections, including how the revenue model for KentuckyWired has not been updated since April of 2017. At that time, the revenue model anticipated 59 subscribers would be connected to KentuckyWired in 2018, and the wholesale access would be producing revenue this year. Given that only 700 miles of the system has been built and none of the system is operational, this revenue model is obviously flawed. Even if the optimistic wholesale revenue projections of $1.3 billion for the Commonwealth are met, much of that funding would be spent covering known costs. Additionally, an unquantified but likely significant part of the revenue is to be shared with the Center for Rural Development pursuant to a contract related to the $23.5 million in federal ARC funding for the project. Again, our entire report, including our recommendations and response from KentuckyWired leadership, will be posted at auditor.ky.gov. Now, as I mentioned earlier, while we are releasing the results of our examination of KentuckyWired today, we are not ending our work. Now, the decision to release the information and findings today is due to the overwhelming interest among taxpayers, stakeholders in the project, and the General Assembly, who are conducting their own investigation through the Program Review and Investigations Committee. But in reviewing areas like procurement, the more information we obtain, the more questions we have. Now, the unresolved questions include who authorized the significant changes between the original terms of the 2014 RFP and the project agreement in 2015 that places 93% of the financial burden of KentuckyWired on the Commonwealth. Now, my office will continue to examine these issues and use any and all authority given to us, including the use of our subpoena power if we deem necessary. Now, I understand this importance to many that KentuckyWired be built because of the potential impact in growing the economies of rural parts of Kentucky that are seeking new opportunities outside the past traditional industries. Providing economic opportunities is a worthwhile goal, especially in areas such as eastern Kentucky, which was the original focus of the federal grant. Now that we know the true cost of KentuckyWired, it is time to reconsider how to accomplish that goal. Now, right now, we continue to pay the cost for this project without seeing any of the benefits. The current structure is not working. Now, due to the flaws in procurement, it will be costly to change course. There are no good options, unfortunately. However, changing course is one of several bad options that should be at least considered. The report discusses the funding out option and acknowledges the real concerns this would create regarding the state's credit rating. If there is a way to fund out of contracts but continue paying bonds, the Commonwealth could mitigate the impact to its bond rating but also avoid paying hundreds of millions of dollars for a statewide network that frankly may never be completed. That money, the savings, could be used to scale back, seek new private partnership, and provide broadband on a more realistic model. Now, taxpayers must also remember that even if all goes well, even if everything went well, completion of the middle mile network will not bring internet to their businesses or doorsteps. Additional investments will be required for years to come, with no guarantee that development will occur in areas that are not profitable for the private companies involved. Now, given the complexity of the agreement surrounding KentuckyWired, the lingering questions that remain, and the fact that the burden of building this system has been placed on taxpayers to the tune of almost $1.5 billion, we must not leave one stone unturned, and certainly we must consider all options. Now, we owe it to all of the Commonwealth to fully examine KentuckyWired, if only to make sure decisions on future projects like this are made in a responsible, transparent fashion, and that the General Assembly certainly has greater oversight on projects like this, especially since we're looking at P3s moving forward. KentuckyWired should be the example of how not to set up a public-private partnership. At this time, I will take questions, and if we have some more technical questions, we certainly have staff available to answer those as well. Yes?
What, I know you said you're going to refer this to, or you have referred this.
Yeah, we will be referring to the Executive Branch Ethics Commission.
Why are you doing that? What potential ethics violations do you see that they need to?
Well, we believe that any official that is representing the state, whether in an elected or an appointed capacity, should have the best interest of the Commonwealth in mind. Given that we have switched from a $30 million state obligation to a $1.5 billion state obligation with no General Assembly approval, with merely the simpleness of a signing of a contract, we believe that that's important to be looked into.
Do you know if the Ethics Commission can hold accountable employees who are no longer in state government?
I'm not positive in that. Certainly we can look into that, but we certainly believe that it's important that they receive it. And obviously in our phase 2 that we are continuing to dig, we may find other items even beyond the Ethics Commission, but right now that's the only information we have available to forward.
Program Review is doing their own investigation.
Correct.
Of this. Secretary Landrum testified a few weeks ago. He said he believed that one of the reasons that they rushed this through the way they did, because they did make
Yes.
change, which we talked about moving the burden of. He believes that one of the reasons they did that was because that the new administration was coming in, the old administration was leaving, and they had a time crunch because they wanted to get this done out of the way before somebody else could come in and not do it. Did you find any evidence of that there was some type of political pressure, because of the timeline of the changing of the
Right. Well, and that's part of what we want to do with the additional exploration into this. Certainly on the surface, it looks as if this was rushed to get out the door. Obviously, the project agreements were signed in September of 2015, which was prior to the election at that time frame, but certainly it was close to the departure of the previous administration, the Bashir administration. Yes.
Why is it still an unresolved question? Who authorized this renegotiation to shift the risks to the state? I mean, don't you know who was in the room?
Well, we know who signed the project agreement. However, beyond that, we need to find out why was the shift? Why did we make the decision? On the surface, we are told that the decision was made to try to save money with the tax-free, make it tax-free. However, from the standpoint, it was a bad deal, as I said, a shell game on the taxpayers to do it in that method. So we need to find out who was the decision maker, who were the decision makers that made that decision to shift the burden all up to the taxpayers, basically.
Who signed it?
Lori Flannery signed the project agreements.
Yeah, so they made the choice to do that because it would lower the overall cost.
That was their assertion. That was their assertion.
But it would shift the risk to the state.
Yes.
But you're
And
not
the
buying-
taxpayers,
You're
yes.
not buying that reason, there might have been some other reason.
We don't know. That's one of the reasons why we're digging further. We're digging further. I mean, obviously, this was not well thought out. If it was well thought out, you would have explored all of the possibilities, looking at not just the best case scenario, but also the worst case scenario. In regards to your savings, it's just like looking at investments. You have investments. If someone told you that you can make 3% or you can make 18%, well, if you don't factor in risk, everybody's going to pick the 18%. But you have to factor in the risk, and I don't think they did. Yes.
Why did Flannery, I think in the report it says that she denied knowing about the E-rate risk? I mean, why would she say that?
I can't speak to her rationale as to why she would say that. However, we have found, as indicated, at least, one warning regarding the E-rate, but also there were additional warnings for the pole attachments. It was as if sirens were going off all around and no one was paying attention to it.
Do you find anything make you believe there was criminal misconduct?
We haven't found anything yet. Obviously, that is one of the reasons that we would want to explore further, just to see if there was any intent. I'm sorry, you had a question?
No, that's fine. When the FCC chairman was here in Kentucky back in April, he was mentioning about FCC monetary incentives to get private businesses
Mhm.
involved in projects like KentuckyWired. Can you talk a little bit more from this survey about the private sector, their contributions, and where they have fallen?
Sure. I mean, from the standpoint, I can't speak in detail. We have staff afterwards that can discuss some of the technical details. But from the standpoint of this specific project, obviously the genesis of it was the $23.5 million that Congressman Rogers obtained for the Eastern Kentucky area, and then somehow or another between that and the beginning of the project, of course, Governor Beshear pushed to expand it statewide, and then beyond that, it created a situation to where if we had stayed focused on just that area, perhaps we could have taken that money and been able to do it. And I've said I don't understand. I mean, I've thought to myself, I don't understand why, because in this particular situation, this would just do the middle mile. This would not get the internet to every house in Eastern Kentucky, every business in Eastern Kentucky. This is just the middle mile, what some call the backbone. But I don't understand why they didn't connect with like the co-ops who run electricity to every house. I don't understand why they didn't utilize other private vendors in addition. To me, it just doesn't make sense when there are avenues out there that they could use. And even if it's the private sector is only going to do something if they seem that it's viable. But in this particular instance, in the original RFP and response, Macquarie indicated they wanted to take on all of that burden, or were willing to take on all that burden. So why did it switch? Why did it switch?
Is it realistic that private businesses could help alleviate this $1.5 billion hole now?
It is realistic to assume that if you funded out but made sure that your bonding was, at least your bond payments were covered, it is realistic to assume that you could potentially do either an additional RFP, or in the cases of P3s, the current P3 legislation allows for a vendor to come forward and present their own option. So, I mean, if a vendor wanted to come forth and say, we'll take it over at 50 cents on the dollar, or however you want to structure it, I mean, there is a possibility for that. Or as I have jokingly said, well, Macquarie originally said that it was going to make all this money, and they were willing to finance it. Well, if they're willing to come back and buy it out, more power to them.
Is Macquarie still involved in the project? A couple times
Well,
you said
they claim they're not. If you read the report, there was some additional reporting that they would have needed to do when they were reached out to them. They said, well, we're no longer doing business in Kentucky. So
they're not involved at all?
well, they are partial owners, and we can for the technicalities of it, we can let you talk to some of our auditors that work directly into it, but they are in many ways partial owners of some of the other companies involved. As you can see, there's somewhat of a convoluted matrix here, but certainly we can get staff to be more specific.
And your recommendation going forward, I know you said there was no good options. Your
Yes.
recommendation is basically for the legislature to stop funding the availability payments.
Well,
which I guess would kill the project. And
the-
then the state would continue making the bond payments, but the project.
That is the best bad object, and that's in my personal opinion, in that particular personal opinion, because the goal of the auditor's office is to find the data, confirm the data, and then report the data. And it is, we believe that both the General Assembly and in many ways the administration has not had all of the information fully in front of them. This gives a much greater picture, hopefully, of the whole picture, if not much more of a picture than they had before, for them to make those informed decisions. But in my personal opinion, I think that's probably, I mean, the best route would be for Macquarie or another vendor just to buy it out, or take it over. But beyond that, you have to find a way to free yourself of all of this additional obligation that has been created by one person signing these project agreements.
How much would that option cost?
It would be several hundred million, but if you can save $1 billion and go back and rebid the project and restore it to an original, what the original concept was, a concessionaire or a vendor would take on all the responsibility or the majority of the responsibility. If you could do that, with $1 billion savings, you could actually come back in and do that either regionally or do it in its entirety.
And the projected $1.5 billion
Yes.
in 30 years, that's if the network never turns on.
Right.
Because if it does turn on and starts generating revenue, it would pay for itself.
Well, that's based on the availability payments. The availability payments, there's more to it than that. And there's if for those of you all have a copy of the report, and you can get with our auditors the specific page, but there's a breakdown on what it is. About 1.1 to 1.2 billion is the availability payments that are being made. So,
But those are supposed to be covered by the network.
well, it was supposed to be,
Revenue from
well, about 45% of it was supposed to be covered by the K through 12 E-rate, and then the rest of it was supposed to be covered by wholesale
So
revenue.
you don't think that they're ever going to get any revenue?
That I can't speak to one way or the other, but it is becoming more and more. Right now, the way that it's structured, there's very little incentive for the contractors to build because they can keep getting these supervening payments that are in question. So it is still possible, but the likelihood of it coming to completion is getting smaller and smaller.
So like a month or so ago, Mr. Brown said that they have all the pole attachment agreements in place and it should be smooth sailing. So now you're saying that that could be true, but there's no incentive for people to work on the pole attachments then?
Well, it's not just pole attachments was one of the major issues regarding this $88 million settlement. But I mean, there are additional supervening events. There are easement, concerns. There are other concerns regarding that. And as I said, that option, the funding out option, but maintain the bonding, that's my personal opinion. The auditor's office specifically is just to give the management, to give the individuals, the General Assembly, the governor, as much information as possible. They may decide to go, a different route. They may decide to go ahead and pursue it to the full extent. But at this point, they have not had all the information we believe that they have not had all the information. And as a matter of fact, even though I was talking to some of my legislative buddies, they were throwing out numbers like 800 million. So even the General Assembly was not aware of this 1.5 billion. And until we did this, I'm not aware of anybody that has reported or told us that we flipped the script from 30 million to 1.5 billion.
Well, they were
in all
aware,
exam.
of the cost, but it's just that they thought private companies.
They thought the private companies were going to cover it.
Because I know as recently
Yeah.
as last year, I think state officials were still saying that.
Oh,
Until
right.
it became clear that wasn't true.
Yes.
So I'm trying to understand the cut and run, so to speak, option.
Well, not necessarily cut and run, but I understand that.
This
somebody-
came up, I think, last year, and some legislators were saying maybe we should just stop funding it.
and then they were told to do that will ultimately cost you even more money because of provisions that were in the contract. You're saying that's not true, it won't cost more to stop the funding.
When it's always a delicate approach because we want to make sure that we don't damage the bonding. But in that project agreement, and in reality the bonding, if you look at what's in the bonding, all the bonding is subject to availability payments, and those availability payments are based on the General Assembly actually providing those. There is nothing, and it's actually in the bond, if you look at the bond documents, there's nothing that mandates a future General Assembly continue making those. And so that is definitely one option. But the problem with that particular option is it does put our bond rating in jeopardy. So we have to make sure that whatever we do in that regards, we take that into consideration. And if there's a way to mitigate that, to basically fund out of the project agreement, but still honor that bonding, either through having someone else come and, take it over and take over the project, or just make those appropriations ourselves, then certainly that is an option. As I said, as someone had jokingly said previously, we don't have any good options, but it's our best bad option. That's probably our best bad option.
When you said 700 miles built, what's the status? How many miles was the whole project?
Well, the whole project was 3,400, give or take 3,400 miles of fiber. They've got about 700 currently, and none of it is functional as of yet. So, yes.
So there was one contractor that refused to be interviewed by you guys.
Every contractor that we worked with provided us the information we requested, but yes, there was one that said that they would not interview with us. And I think part of that was because this settlement has not been concluded. This $88 million settlement has not actually been concluded. And so they felt like that may cause some problems. But every contractor that we worked with and reached out to, when we asked for specific information, they did provide it. So, any other
Yeah,
questions?
the 1.5 billion, I'm still hung up on that. Does that include the cost of paying for internet service the state would have bought anyway? It's gonna buy?
The one point, if there's a chart in our audit, but basically the breakdown is about 1.1, 1.2 billion. The largest portion of that is the availability payments. Those payments we will make whether it's working, whether it's not working, whether we're making revenue off of it, or we're not making it out. Now we're not bound to make them, but in order to try to preserve the bond rating, I'm assuming that they would make every attempt to either pay that or mitigate it in some way.
Because part of those availability payments is the bond payment.
Yes, part of the availability payments are the bond payments.
And did the state have a opt-out contract, and does it still?
In the original RFP and response that Macquarie had indicated that they would take basically full responsibility for, there was, before the project agreement was inked, there was a situation there where they could, if Macquarie failed to perform, they could terminate and move on and find another provider after a year's time. Now, there are, even in the project agreement, there are some termination situations. You can terminate just because you decide to, you can terminate for cause, but in those termination agreements, we're still on the hook as the Commonwealth for those bonds.
I know in 2014, when it was originally announced,
Yes.
the first agreement was signed.
Yes.
That the plan was to have all the.
See, I was in the General Assembly.
All the risk on the.
I was in the General Assembly.
And then it changed.
Yes.
Sometime between December 2014 and September 2015.
Yes.
When it changed, was the legislature ever briefed about that or told?
I was in the General Assembly. We were not aware of these massive changes.
Because originally that was true when
Yeah.
they first said it.
Yeah.
And then it became not true, but
Right.
whenever that happened.
Well, the original $30 million that the General Assembly appropriated occurred during the 2014 legislative session. Yeah.
Have you heard any concerns from the feds since they chipped in on this?
Well, I haven't heard yet. Of course, you do realize that for the Eastern Kentucky portion of it, there's no money that's actually been paid out. It was appropriated and it's sitting there, but they're not going to pay that out they did their due diligence better because they're not going to pay out anything until such time that it goes live.
But we're
That-
paying interest on it?
We are paying interest on it. I don't understand that. I mean, I don't understand that, but we are paying interest on money we don't have, and will not have unless it goes live.
Right, because this is the federal money.
This is federal money.
We're paying interest.
And there's two phases of it. There's 15 million and there's a potential 8.5 million more for a total of 23. But we haven't received any of it, and we have paid interest on money that we have not received. So,
And when the legislators voted for this, including you, Mike.
yes.
w-
Well, actually, I didn't vote for the funding. So,
Oh, okay.
yes.
But were you all aware that some of the money would go to the Center for Rural Development in Somerset? Were you aware of that?
Well, we were aware of the 23.5 million. Now remember, this was part of an overall budget bill. So those who voted for it and those who voted against it, there were multiple reasons why you vote for or vote against. But we were sold on the ideal that the 23.5 million was for Eastern Kentucky. That's what Congressman Rogers pushed for. His goal was for Eastern Kentucky, and then Governor Beshear came in and wanted to expand it fully, and we were pretty much, from the standpoint of led to believe that, we would do our $30 million appropriation, and that would be pretty much it. And then someone flipped the script, and it's not worked out too well for the taxpayers.
If the 1.5 billion, and I'm sorry,
No, you're fine.
So if the
You're fine.
1.5 billion is for if it never turns on, are you able to calculate how much it would be if it does turn on and everything like that?
The biggest problem is so much of the information that they had is speculative as to how much revenue. Now, we do know that if they were able to have obtained the E-rate, we came to the conclusion that it would be about 45% of those availability payments. However, there were warnings, even prior to the project agreement being signed, that E-rate would probably not be available, and yet they still ignored those warnings.
And the way the E-rate works, that's, money we pay, but the federal government reimburses.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's federal money.
It's federal money. It's still taxpayer dollars, but it's federal money as opposed to others. Any other questions?
Did auditors ever cover any analysis of the risk this whole technology is obsolete?
Well, and part of this chart, especially like where some of the spiking is, there are provisions in the project agreement that this will be refreshed from time to time. And you can get with our auditors, but I believe that cost was somewhere around $80–90 million, and that was our best estimate in that regard. So that they did take into consideration the refreshing, but that still falls on the Commonwealth and the taxpayers.
This is the middleman model.
This is the middle model. That's what I said. It's not taking it directly to the house, which
Do
we.
they have any current verbal or, is there any agreement by any company once it is turned on to be that last mile? Have they reached any?
We can once we're done here, we'll let you talk to our auditors to get to the specifics. I mean, I know there were some that expressed interest. At this time, I'm not sure specifically if there's any. Now, of course, open source is supposed to handle all of the wholesale revenue in that particular regards. But even with open source, if you look at those contracts, there's no minimum. For me, there's some concerns with that as well.
I know this wasn't in your purview, but were you aware of any other private developers that wanted to come in and provide internet service in the areas of the
Well,
state?
if you look at the initial RFP, if the initial RFP had been structured where basically the Commonwealth was going to take over all the responsibility, you can imagine there would be more than just Macquarie that would have bid it. But the way that it was structured originally was that private partner, that private vendor, was going to take on, and the private investors would take on the majority of the risk. So if they had gone back and rebid this RFP under the new scenario, we may have had, but we'll never know. We'll never know. So, other questions? All right. Well, thank you all so very much. We appreciate you. If you have more technical questions, we do have staff available that can help you with that. Thank you all, and God bless.
Yeah.